Hi everyone, my name's Nick Hogwood. Welcome to this introduction to ethnography. I'm just going to share my screen now and take you through this presentation. So this is an introduction to ethnography, but an interesting, I hope, approach. I'm not going to give you kind of like a how to do ethnography. What I'm going to give is like an overview of what ethnography can mean, but particularly show how the answer, what is ethnography and what does it mean to do it well, varies according to where you are in history, in the world, and in the discipline or kind of post-disciplinary field that you're in. And that's a really important thing to understanding ethnography. So, ethnography there, I've written it in its Greek writing because it's a Greek word originally. Ethnos, meaning kind of people, and grapho, meaning to write about. So I'm wondering what ethnography kind of means to you when you hear that word. What comes to mind? What words would you associate with it? And perhaps what questions do you have? I'd be really interested and happy for you to comment below on this video or raise any questions if you're one of the students who's actually working with me in some of the teaching that I'm doing. But yeah, it's really interesting to think, what does that kind of immediately trigger for you? Now, here's one quote I got from kind of ethnoinsight.com, and there's some things that I think are really important in here. It's the study of people in their natural or native environments. So the idea of naturalism here doesn't mean like nature, but it means without necessarily interfering. At least that's a traditional view. Where they live, work, shop, play. It's a set of complementary techniques. I love that, and it's pointing here to the idea that ethnography originally developed in the discipline of anthropology. I love that it just requires a well-trained and skillful researcher. And that we immerse ourselves in particular environments, cultures, populations. The rapport, the relationships we have with people are really crucial in ethnography. And that we interact through participation, observation and dialogue to uncover different attitudes, beliefs and perceptions. And I love this final part, the unspoken cultural patterns. In fact, the last ethnography I did, I had a budget to do interviews and I didn't do any because in the end, my observations and the other kind of interactions I had with people helped me understand things that were kind of true, but the people wouldn't have necessarily said themselves in an interview. And I think that's fantastic. Here's another quote from O'Reilly. This is about ethnography being an iterative research that evolves in design through the study, drawing on a family of methods. And so we had, before complementary techniques, this time a family of methods involving direct and sustained contact. Now, it's interesting to think what direct contact means now that we kind of live in a digital age and we have netnography or digital ethnographies or hybrid ethnographies. I love the idea of the context of daily lives, watching what happens, listening, asking questions, and producing richly written accounts. Of course, these days, ethnography isn't just written up. Sometimes it can be performed or danced or represented in visual and other kind of forms. But I love the idea here that we're pointing to the researcher role and the role of theory. Now, I'm going to give here a partial history of ethnography, and it's partial in so many ways. And I really want to be clear about this. This is not the history of ethnography around the world. It misses out certain key things about ethnography. It misses out certain key political debates. It misses out some methodological debates. It misses out a whole bunch of things more recently kind of developed around digital ethnography. It misses out certain important parts of the world. There's kind of French ethnographies that I've read that I haven't represented here. The point is not that I'm exhaustive. I'm really clear I'm being partial. The point is to show that ethnography is contested. And the answer to what is ethnography, how do you do ethnography, how do you do it well, varies. And the partial history I'm going to give here is sufficient to illustrate and help you hopefully understand that point. So when you say I'm doing ethnography, you can kind of locate that a little bit better perhaps. So we're going to jump into our time machine now and go back to the 1920s. And here we have kind of what many people will attribute to the kind of the origins of ethnography. Malinowski, Bronislaw Malinowski, a British social anthropologist. And he went off to what's now Papua New Guinea. And he wrote, imagine yourself suddenly set down, surrounded by all your gear, alone on a tropical beach, close to a native village, while the launch or dinghy, which has brought you, sails away out of sight. And that's very evocative of somebody going off to an exotic part of the world that they didn't know anything about. Being left there. I think as far as I'm aware, Malinowski wasn't as alone as he said he was. I think his wife was with him. Anyway, from this came this idea of long fieldwork as a rite of passage and special ethnographic attention to detail and the focus on everyday life. Now, I've deliberately put that black and white picture up there because I think it's extremely confronting. It makes me very uncomfortable to think about the politics and the colonialism that happened, not just kind of in the context of ethnography, but actually happened through the conduct of ethnographic research. You know, kind of a white man and then others sitting before them like this. That kind of sort of strong asymmetry like that is rightly questioned. But this idea of ethnography being long-term immersion in something that you don't understand and are unfamiliar with, going from an etic perspective and outsiders to an emic perspective, knowing the same about this phenomenon as an insider would, that still informs and shapes what ethnography means today. Jumping back into our time machine, 1950s, and we moved from one discipline to another. Now I'm thinking particularly about sociology and ethnographic studies done in educational settings. Now in that time, in England, lots of people, sociologists, were interested in the reproduction of social class. How is it that working class kids end up getting working class jobs and having more working class kids? Now, this ethnography of industrial society, lots of people graduating through their PhDs ended up taking jobs in sociology departments. And they did a lot of studies in schools because they thought the answer to this question of how is class reproduced in Britain, we should look in schools. Now, schools were not the same as whole cultures like Malinowski was looking at. And they weren't as foreign to these ethnographers. Most of them had been to a British school, and there they were studying British schooling. Okay, so that sense of, you know, being alone, abandoned by your ship on this native island with people and language you didn't understand, that wasn't the case here. And we have to think about what was happening in sociology at the time. Okay, we're on the cusp of the quantitative revolution, and statistics and computer power coming out. And sociology was fighting amongst other disciplines to try and be kind of a proper discipline, and be robust and kind of have its match with proper science. And so that shaped the way that people did ethnography there. Now, they weren't spending years and years and years in these foreign environments, but there was still an emphasis on quite long field work. But if you look at the language used in these writings about ethnography in the schools, and I'm thinking of Paul Willis's Learning to Labour, Social Relations in a Secondary School, and Beachside Comprehensive, all sorts of ethnographies like that. What we see is a kind of a language that reflects that sort of more kind of evidence-based and rigorous approach with, you know, focus on methods and rigor, data and evidence. And still we see that in Hammersley and Atkinson's writing about ethnography, and that's been hugely formative for me as an educational ethnographer, to think about ethnography as sort of in this sort of pseudo-scientific way. That doesn't make it positivist and all those kind of things, but it does suggest a kind of particular attention to evidence and a way of writing about ethnography that's different. Back into our time machine, forward at least 30 years and crossing the Atlantic, and then back into anthropology. And of course, I'm making big generalizations here. The point is not to sort of, you know, override variations and nuances, but to make a point about some key differences to illustrate that ethnography is contested according to time, space, discipline, and politics. So now in the US, at that time, there was this big focus on working through big theoretical ideas like Marxism and socialism and political resistance and, you know, capitalism and what these things meant and protest. And so the cues were more from these kind of big theoretical and contested debates rather than from sort of natural things like a school or an institution. And so ethnography was not sort of something you could just plop into some stable community, culture, or institution like a school. So the ethnographers had to move around and start doing multi-sited ethnographies. They were saying the phenomenon we're interested in is dispersed. So our ethnography has to be dispersed as well. And often as a result of this, fieldwork was shorter. It was more a question of the match between kind of the phenomenon and the way that you did our ethnography than adherence to this idea that you have to be there for at least a year or 18 months or 2 years. The picture I've shown here is George Marcus, who's a strong proponent of that. Now, British anthropology, and I put the word today there, I'm not sure this was certainly true in the kind of the early 2000s. The myth surrounding Malinowski, kind of, you can see traces of this. And I'm not suggesting that these are people who wholesale subscribe to the idea of Malinowski sort of faking being on his own, or kind of some of the colonial politics of that. But there has been a defense of classical fieldwork, but not the stereotype of it, particularly kind of Judith Oakley. Now, she's not suggesting that we have to kind of go ahead and pretend we were isolated as Malinowski was, and other things like that. But this kind of, particularly in the sort of some strands of British anthropology, this idea that being there a long time really matters, not just for the sake of hanging out for a long time, but because it's through that duration that you get emergent qualities, things you weren't expected can come up. And there's an open-endedness and a messiness that comes out of long-term, in-depth fieldwork. And I also am really shaped by this argument still. My last ethnography that I did was in a very small institution called Karatani here in Sydney. And I spent 9 months there, most days of the week. And had I only spent 3 months, I wouldn't have got the same findings. Had I spent only 6 months, it wouldn't have been the same. And after 9 months, I probably could have gone on and still found there was some new things out, but I had sort of reached a stability there. But that 9 months gave me a chance to see what was normal, see lots of different unusual things, see real challenges that came up in this institution, and really get under the fabric of things. So I have sympathies with Judith Oakley's defense of the length of fieldwork being something that can bring particular qualities to ethnography. But that doesn't mean that you have to define ethnography by its duration, right? That's really important. Jumping back into our time machine up to the 1990s, where we get what you might call post-disciplinary ethnography. Okay, and this is ethnography where it started, the practice of ethnography is more and more not being specifically defined and anchored to any one discipline. Plus, we're getting into now a stage where kind of these traditional disciplines were being eroded at the boundaries and new fields were coming up that sort of span disciplines. So we have ethnography being used in health research, in market research, in business studies, and by businesses, right? Not just academics doing research, but businesses were using ethnography to see how consumers interacted with products, for example. Being used in communication studies, studies of science and technology. I'm thinking particularly of Bruno Latour's Woolgar's laboratory life. Now they kind of use that to network theory, but essentially that's a deeply ethnographic study, if you ask me, in many ways, or lots of principles of ethnography are being used there. Often from the 19s onwards, there was much more collaboration with participants, not this idea of sort of, researcher researching others, but researching together. And ethnography was being increasingly tied in with activism, trying to change the environments that were being studied, not just study naturalistic environments. And the way ethnographies are being funded has changed as well, right? Sarah Pink, one of my absolute kind of dream ethnographers, wrote this beautiful books and still writes beautifully around sensory ethnographies. It really showed to me kind of how important the body and the whole senses are in the conduct of ethnography. Quite a different discourse from that of kind of, the educational ethnographers around evidence. And I think, both can complement each other. Now, she did some practice funded by Unilever on laundry practices. She did some ethnography on that, and she was in people's homes. And of course, she couldn't just choose one home and hang out there for a year. She went to lots of different homes. So there were kind of elements of kind of the multi-sited and the shorter duration fieldwork there. But there were big questions coming through about British identity and class still. But also this kind of the lovely juicy materiality of how it is that people take, towels out of their washing machines and what they feel and how that informs their judgments. But she gave one report off to Unilever and she wrote some fantastic scholarly work as well. I'm thinking also of Kate Fox's fabulous book called Watching the English, an ethnography of English everyday life. And she did all sorts of things. It's a beautiful book, kind of really precise with its concepts and deep in its insights, but really accessible. And now she was English. Okay, so they've not got Malinowski going off to an island over there and living there for 3 years without understanding anything. She did ethnography as something that was extremely familiar to her own country, citizens and things like that. So I'm not in favour of any particular version of ethnography myself. I'm not an anthropologist. I tend to lean towards a version of ethnography which is probably shaped most by British educational ethnographers, Hammersley, Walford, Delamont and others, but I've been very informed by Sarah Pink. The links to their theoretical ideas from kind of George Marcus and kind of that American tradition have been very influential. So have French traditions from Bourdieu. And Louis Vacantes and the kind of the notebooks of an apprentice boxer, or kind of lots of ethnographic kind of influences for me. And being in Australia, I also have to take very seriously decolonising Indigenous methodologies and think about what I could learn from those in research that I'm doing, whether it involves Indigenous communities or not. But what I love about ethnography is that we have these debates. I think they're brilliant for the health of ethnography. I don't think it matters whether there is one definition of ethnography or not. I do think it matters that we just don't say anything goes, right? That not everything can be ethnography. But these different definitions and these different emphases and these different kind of ideas about what it means to do ethnography well are brilliant for our intellectual hygiene. They force us into asking questions. They force us into kind of justifying the way we do ethnography and thinking about why we do it in particular ways. And that's why I think this kind of sort of historical understanding of ethnography is really valuable. So there we go, there's my partial history of ethnography. Okay, so ethnography is alive, it's changing. Ethnography is what ethnographers do. And ethnographers come from different disciplines, different moments in history, different countries, different kind of moments in the history of disciplines, in the particular debates and contests that are happening within disciplines, as well as now in a very post-disciplinary field. So this makes ethnography tremendously exciting. And if you're saying, you know, I'm going to do ethnography, or I'm doing ethnography, I think it's really helpful to think, okay, so where do you fit in this global history, this evolution of ethnography? It's the most exciting time ever to be an ethnographer. The options available are wider than they've ever been. And that doesn't mean we can be flabby with our concepts and just let anything go in our methods, but it does mean we can enter these fantastically juicy debates and think about the kind of ethnography that's going to serve our needs and the needs of the people we're working with and working for the best. Well, that's it for me. I promised a little bit of introduction. I hope this has been useful. I really hope that you're able to add some comments on the below here. I'd love to have some more questions from you. Let me know what you think, particularly tell me what I missed out. I mentioned it as partial history of ethnography. Tell me what I missed. Bring in other parts of the world, other debates in ethnography, other positions that people take about what it means to do ethnography well. This is not the end of things. I really hope to have a conversation with you about these things. All right, thank you very much. Bye-bye.